The phone rang just after dawn, and Jacob Morrison stood at his kitchen window, watching the first light touch the hills beyond his ranch, and he let it ring 3 times before answering, because that was his way now, after living alone for so many years. The voice on the other end was young and frightened, and it cut through the quiet morning like a knife through butter. "Please," she said, and her voice was shaking so badly he could barely make out the words. "Please don't let him kill me." Jacob gripped the phone tighter and felt something shift in his chest that hadn't moved in a very long time. "Where are you?" he asked, and his voice was rough from disuse, but steady. "I don't know," she whispered, and he could hear wind in the background and the sound of her breathing hard like she'd been running. "And I saw your number on a fence post about a mile back, and it said Morrison Ranch, and I just kept walking until I found a gas station with a payphone." "Stay there," he said, "and tell me what the place looks like." She described the old Chevron station at the crossroads, and he knew it well because he'd been getting his gas there for 30 years, and he told her to go inside and wait, and that he'd be there in 15 minutes. He didn't ask any more questions then, because he could hear the terror in her voice, and questions could wait, and fear couldn't. Jacob grabbed his truck keys and his old denim jacket and headed out into the morning that was still cool and fresh with the smell of sage and dust. The drive to the gas station felt longer than it should have, and his mind wandered back to another time when someone had needed help, and he hadn't been there, and that was a weight he'd carried for more years than he cared to count. When he pulled into the gas station, he saw her right away standing by the newspaper rack outside, and she looked like a wild thing ready to bolt at any sudden movement. She was small and young, and her long dark hair was tangled and dusty, and there was a bruise blooming purple along her cheekbone. Her clothes were torn in places, and she had nothing with her except the fear in her eyes. Jacob got out of the truck slowly and kept his hands where she could see them, and he spoke softly like he was approaching a spooked horse. "I'm Jacob," he said, "and you called me." She nodded and wrapped her arms around herself, even though the morning wasn't that cold. "I'm Sarah," she said, and then her voice broke, and I didn't know where else to go. He didn't ask her to explain right there in the parking lot with the gas station attendant watching through the window and morning traffic starting to pick up on the highway. "Come on," he said, and gestured to the truck, "and we'll get you somewhere safe." She hesitated for just a moment, and he could see her weighing her options and deciding whether to trust this stranger, who was old enough to be her grandfather. Something in his face must have convinced her, because she walked to the truck and climbed in, and he noticed she winced when she moved like her ribs hurt. They drove back to the ranch in silence, and Jacob didn't push, because he'd learned long ago that silence could be a kindness when words were too hard to find. The ranch house sat at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by rolling hills and cottonwood trees, and a creek that ran year-round through the property. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just a simple wooden structure that Jacob had built himself 40 years ago with his wife Margaret before the cancer took her. Inside it was clean and sparse with furniture that had seen better days but was comfortable and worn in all the right places. He showed Sarah to the guest room that hadn't been used since his daughter Emma visited last Christmas, and he pulled out clean towels from the linen closet and told her the bathroom was across the hall. "You're safe here," he said, and that seemed like the most important thing to establish first. She nodded but didn't quite believe him yet, and he could see that in the way she positioned herself near the door and kept glancing at the windows. "I'll make some breakfast," he said, "and you take your time." In the kitchen, he made coffee and scrambled eggs and toast with butter and strawberry jam that Emma had made last summer and sent him home with. When Sarah finally emerged, she'd washed her face and combed her hair as best she could, and she'd changed into a clean shirt he'd left on the bed that had belonged to Emma years ago. They sat at the kitchen table and ate in silence for a while, and Jacob noticed she was hungry in that deep way that spoke of not having eaten properly for days. Finally, she started to talk, and the words came slowly at first, and then faster, like a dam breaking. She'd been living with a man named Derek for 2 years, and at first he'd been charming and attentive, but slowly things had changed. The anger had started small with raised voices and slammed doors, but it had grown into something darker and more dangerous. She'd tried to leave before, but he always found her and promised to change, and she'd believed him because she wanted to believe that the man she'd fallen in love with was still in there somewhere. But 3 nights ago, he'd Hurt her badly enough that she knew if she stayed he would eventually kill her. She'd waited until he passed out drunk, and then she'd taken nothing but the clothes on her back and started walking. She'd walked through the night and into the morning, and when she saw Jacob's phone number on that fence post, it felt like a sign from somewhere beyond herself. Jacob listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he just nodded slowly. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. "But he'll find me," she whispered, and her hands were shaking around her coffee cup. "We'll figure it out," he said, and meant it. The first few days were quiet and careful as they moved around each other like dancers learning new steps. Sarah slept a lot because her body needed time to heal, and Jacob went about his daily routine of tending to the horses and fixing fences and doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. He'd been alone for so long that having another person in the house felt strange, at first, but not unwelcome. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sun go down behind the mountains, and sometimes they'd talk and sometimes they wouldn't, and both were okay. She told him about her childhood in a small town in Nevada, and parents who'd meant well but hadn't known what to do with a daughter who dreamed bigger than the life they'd planned for her. He told her about Margaret, and how they'd met at a county fair when they were both 17, and how she'd agreed to marry him, even though he had nothing but a dream of owning land and raising horses. They talked about Emma and how she lived in Denver now with a husband and 2 kids, and how she worried about Jacob being alone, but respected his need for solitude on. The 4th day, Jacob drove into town and came back with bags from the general store filled with clothes in Sarah's size, and toiletries, and a new pair of boots. "You didn't have to do that," she said. But her eyes were wet with tears. He just shrugged and said everybody needs boots on a ranch. She started helping with the chores, and at first he protested, but she insisted, and he realized she needed something to do with her hands and her mind. She was good with the horses, and they responded to her gentle touch and quiet voice. There was one horse in particular that had always been skittish and hard to handle, but Sarah spent hours with him just standing in his stall and talking softly. And after a week, he was eating out of her hand. Jacob watched this transformation and saw something he recognized from his own past, which was a wounded soul, trying to heal itself through connection with something pure and uncomplicated. 2 weeks in, Sarah asked if she could use his phone to call her sister in California. The conversation lasted an hour and involved crying and apologies and promises to visit once things settled down. When she hung up, she told Jacob her sister had been trying to find her for days and had even filed a missing persons report. He said that was good because it meant people cared, and caring was never something to take for granted. They fell into a rhythm that felt natural and unforced, and the ranch seemed less lonely with 2 people moving through it. Sarah learned how to mend fences and stack hay bales and check the irrigation system. Jacob taught her the way he'd once taught Emma, with patience and repetition, and the kind of attention that said, "This matters, and you matter." One morning, about 3 weeks after Sarah arrived, Jacob found her crying in the barn, and he sat down beside her in the hay and waited. "I'm scared," she said, "and I keep thinking every car that drives by is him, and I don't know how to stop being afraid." "Fear's a hard thing," he said, "and I won't tell you not to feel it because that wouldn't be honest, but I will tell you that courage isn't about not being afraid." He continued, "And it's about being afraid and doing what you need to do anyway." She looked at him then, with those dark eyes that had seen too much for someone so young, and she said, "How do you know that?" "Because I spent 20 years being afraid after Margaret died," he said, "and afraid of living without her, and afraid of being alone, and afraid of moving forward, and one day I realized that fear was keeping me from really living, and so I made a choice to be afraid and live anyway." They sat there for a long time in the dusty light of the barn, and somewhere outside a horse whinnied, and the wind moved through the cottonwood trees. That afternoon they drove into town together, and Sarah filed for a restraining order with the sheriff's office. The deputy was a woman named Carol, who'd been in Jacob's daughter's class in high school, and she took Sarah's statement with kindness and efficiency. She also made it clear that Derek would be arrested if he came anywhere near her, and that the law would take this seriously. Driving home, Jacob felt Sarah relax beside him in a way she hadn't since that first